The rain struck the tall windows of Ashford Manor like a warning that could not be ignored. Eleanor Ashford stood very still in her father's study, her hands folded in front of her the way she had been taught since childhood. Outside, gray clouds pressed low over the land, and water ran down the glass in thin lines, like tears she refused to shed. Inside the room, the fire burned low, and the man who had always been her protector could not bring himself to look at her. Lord Richard Ashford looked older than his years. His hair had gone almost white in a single season, and his shoulders bent under a weight Eleanor now understood too well. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled, though he tried to sound firm. He spoke of debts, of losses, of obligations that could no longer be avoided. Eleanor listened quietly, already sensing where this was going, her heart slowing, as if bracing for a fall. "The Duke of Greystone has agreed to settle everything," her father said at last. "In return, he requires a wife." The words settled between them, heavy and final. Eleanor did not ask questions. She did not cry. She had grown up knowing that women like her were raised not only to be daughters, but solutions. She nodded once, slowly, and answered in a calm voice that cost her more than her father would ever know. "I understand, Father." That night, alone in her room, Eleanor allowed herself one small moment of grief. She had once imagined love, imagined a marriage built on warmth and laughter. She had dreamed of being chosen, not traded. By morning, those dreams were gone, washed away like the rain from the night before. 3 days later, a leather portfolio arrived with a solicitor who did not smile. Eleanor read the contract in silence. The words were cold and exact. There was no mention of affection or companionship. The Duke required an heir and a duchess who would host his home. In exchange, her family would be saved. Eleanor signed her name with steady hands, though each letter felt like something precious slipping away. The wedding took place beneath a sky as gray as her thoughts. Greystone Cathedral rose before her carriage, dark and severe, more like a monument than a place of joy. The guests were few. Eleanor understood why. No family wished to announce that their daughter had been given away to pay a debt. When she saw the Duke for the first time, standing tall at the altar, her breath caught despite herself. Adrian Thornwell was striking in a way that felt distant and cold, like winter sunlight. His expression held no warmth, only restraint. His eyes, gray and unreadable, watched her approach with careful attention, as if assessing a responsibility rather than greeting a bride. The ceremony passed quickly. His voice was calm and controlled. When the vows were done, he did not kiss her. He simply offered his arm and led her away. It was in the quiet space near the doors that he finally spoke to her. "We must be clear," he said, his voice low and even. "This marriage is an arrangement. You will have comfort and respect, but do not expect love. I cannot offer it." Something inside Eleanor cracked, though her face remained composed. She inclined her head. "I understand, Your Grace." The journey to Greystone Hall was silent. Miles passed beneath the carriage wheels, but Eleanor felt as though she were standing still, watching her life move away from her. Greystone Hall loomed ahead, all graystone and narrow windows. It felt less like a home and more like a fortress. The staff greeted them with perfect formality. Adrian acknowledged them briefly, then led Eleanor inside without ceremony. He showed her the house quickly, without warmth or detail. Drawing rooms, halls, and staircases passed in a blur. When they reached the west wing, he stopped. "These are your rooms," he said. "My chambers are in the east wing. We will keep separate schedules." Eleanor nodded again. That gesture was becoming familiar. That evening, she dressed carefully for dinner, hoping perhaps for conversation. The dining hall was vast. Adrian sat at the far end of the table. They ate in silence, the sound of silver against china echoing like an accusation. Days turned into weeks. Eleanor learned the rhythm of the house and her place within it. Adrian was gone before she woke. She ate alone. She walked the halls alone. Greystone Hall was beautiful, orderly, and unbearably empty. The library became her refuge. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with books that showed signs of being well loved. Eleanor spent hours there, reading by the window, finding comfort in words when her own life felt too quiet. One afternoon, Adrian entered the library and stopped short when he saw her. Surprise flickered across his face. "I did not realize anyone used this room," he said. "I hope I am not intruding," Eleanor replied gently. "You did say I was mistress of the house." Something shifted in his expression. He nodded and reached for a book. For a brief moment, their worlds touched, and Eleanor sensed there was more beneath his cold manner than he allowed anyone to see. That night, for the first time since her wedding, Eleanor felt something dangerous stir inside her. Hope. Winter settled over Greystone Hall slowly, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Frost crept along the windows each morning, and the moor beyond the manor turned hard and colorless. Eleanor moved through the days quietly, filling her hours with books, letters never sent, and long walks through halls that echoed with her footsteps. She had learned the habits of the house and, more painfully, the habits of her husband. Adrian Thornwell remained distant, yet no longer entirely absent. He did not avoid her now. Instead, he existed near her, like a shadow that never quite touched. He would appear in the library while she read, taking a chair across the room. They did not speak at first. They simply shared the silence, and somehow that silence felt different than before, less sharp, less lonely. Eleanor noticed small things. He favored history and estate records, but kept volumes of poetry close at hand. He frowned when he read passages that stirred memory. Sometimes, when he thought she was not looking, his gaze would lift from his book and rest on her, thoughtful and troubled, before he quickly looked away. One evening, thunder broke across the sky without warning. The storm arrived with violent force, shaking the windows and filling the halls with sudden noise. Eleanor froze where she stood in the library, her heart racing. Memories she had buried rushed back, leaving her breath shallow and her hands shaking. When the lights went out, panic took hold of her completely. She sank to the floor beside the chair, wrapping her arms around herself, trembling as thunder cracked again. She did not hear the door open. She only knew she was no longer alone when she heard her name spoken urgently. Eleanor. She looked up to see Adrian kneeling beside her, a candle in his hand. His face was pale with concern, stripped of its usual distance. Without hesitation, he sat beside her and took her hand, holding it firmly. "You are safe," he said steadily. "I will not leave you." He stayed. As the storm raged, he spoke quietly, telling her stories of his childhood, of his mother reading to him in this very room, of small moments filled with warmth she could hardly imagine him ever having known. His voice was calm and grounding, and slowly Eleanor's fear eased. When the storm passed, he helped her to her feet. The moment lingered, fragile and real. Then his walls returned. He stepped back, nodded once, and left without another word. After that night, everything felt different. They began speaking more often, cautiously at first. A comment about a book. A question about the estate. Their dinners together became regular, no longer marked by silence stretching across the table. Adrian listened when she spoke, truly listened. Once he even asked her opinion on tenant matters, studying her face as if her thoughts mattered. Eleanor found herself falling in love slowly and painfully, knowing she should not, knowing it could only end one way. The gardens drew her attention next. Though overgrown, they held signs of careful design. When she asked Adrian for permission to restore them, his reaction startled her. Pain crossed his face, raw and unguarded. "They were my mother's," he said. "No one has touched them since she died." Eleanor understood at once. She apologized, but Adrian surprised her by granting permission. The next morning, she began the work. Days later, she looked up from the earth to find Adrian beside her, sleeves rolled, hands in the soil. They worked together in silence, something intimate growing between them with every shared moment. That closeness frightened him. One evening, seated near each other by the fire, Adrian reached for her hand. His fingers hovered inches away before he pulled back abruptly, standing as though burned. "I should not have," he said harshly. "Forgive me." He left her alone with tears she refused to shed and the certainty she could no longer deny. She loved him. The next day, Eleanor avoided the library. Her heart could not bear the fragile hope rising and falling at his command. It was then that Mrs. Davies spoke to her quietly, revealing the truth Adrian had never shared. He had loved once before. His first wife had died in childbirth. His love, he believed, had killed her. Understanding came like a blow. Adrian was not cold because he lacked feeling. He was cold because he feared love itself. That night, as snow began to fall, Eleanor made her decision. She could not live this way any longer. Love without warmth was another kind of loneliness. Before dawn, she wrote a letter and began to pack. When Adrian entered her chambers and saw the trunks, something inside him broke. "You cannot leave," he said, his voice unsteady. "I must," Eleanor replied quietly. "This marriage is killing me." She tried to go, but every door was locked. Adrian stood in the entrance hall, undone and desperate, admitting everything he had never allowed himself to feel. "I love you," he said at last. "I have loved you for months." Eleanor listened, heart aching, tears falling freely. When he unlocked every door and stepped aside, giving her back her freedom, she understood the truth of his words. "I will stay," she said softly. "But only if we face this together. No more walls. No more silence." Adrian agreed without hesitation. And for the first time since her wedding day, Eleanor felt something solid beneath her feet. Not certainty, but possibility. Spring came slowly to Greystone Hall, as if the land itself needed reassurance before it dared to bloom again. Snow melted into soft earth, and pale green shoots appeared where Eleanor and Adrian had worked side by side months before. The manor felt different now. Windows were opened. Fires burned, not from necessity, but comfort. The silence that once ruled the halls had been replaced by quiet conversation and, at times, gentle laughter. Eleanor stayed, but she did not return to the life she had been living before. She no longer waited in silence or made herself small. Adrian kept his promise. He spoke when fear rose in him instead of retreating. Some days it was difficult. Old habits clung stubbornly, and there were moments when his instinct was still to withdraw. But now, when that happened, he returned. He chose her, every time. They spent long evenings in the library, not as strangers sharing space, but as husband and wife learning each other anew. Adrian spoke of his past without shame now. He spoke of his mother, of how her death had first taught him that love could vanish without warning. He spoke of Catherine not as a ghost that haunted him, but as a chapter of his life that had shaped him. Eleanor listened without jealousy. She understood that loving him meant accepting his scars, not competing with them. Eleanor, in turn, spoke of her childhood, of growing up in a house where appearance mattered more than affection, of learning early how to behave, how to endure, how to be useful. Adrian listened with a tenderness that still surprised her. He did not interrupt. He did not minimize her pain. He held her hand and let her words settle between them. Trust grew slowly, like the gardens outside. It required patience, care, and the willingness to face discomfort. There were days when fear returned, sharp and sudden, especially when Eleanor fell ill with a simple fever one night. Adrian did not leave her side. He sat awake until dawn, terror plain on his face, until she opened her eyes and smiled weakly at him. "I am here," she whispered. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. Their marriage, once a contract, became a partnership. Adrian invited Eleanor into every part of his life, Estate matters were discussed together. Decisions were made jointly. The staff noticed the change quickly. Mrs. Davies watched with quiet satisfaction as her master softened, as the Duchess moved through the house with confidence and warmth instead of restraint. The gardens flourished under Eleanor's care. Roses bloomed again where weeds had once ruled. Paths were cleared. The fountain was restored, water flowing once more like a promise kept. Adrian spent hours beside her there, hands in the earth, speaking of plans for the future with a hope he had once believed dangerous. One afternoon, as they rested beneath an old oak tree, Adrian spoke carefully. "I have been thinking about children," he said. "Not from duty, from hope." Eleanor reached for his hand, understanding the weight of what he was offering. "When the fear no longer rules you," she said gently. "When love feels stronger than loss." Adrian nodded. He did not rush her. He did not rush himself. Love, Eleanor learned, was not a sudden blaze. It was a choice, made daily. A hand reached for instead of pulled away. A truth spoken instead of hidden. And in that choosing, they found something deeper than passion alone. They found safety. 2 years passed. Greystone Hall stood transformed, not by wealth or grandeur, but by life. The gardens were alive with color. The halls echoed with footsteps that moved with purpose rather than avoidance. Adrian laughed now, openly and without fear. Eleanor carried herself with a confidence she had never known before. On a warm afternoon, Eleanor sat in the garden beneath the oak tree, her hand resting on her belly. Adrian knelt beside her, his expression filled with wonder as he felt the movement beneath her palm. "Our child," he said softly, his voice full of awe rather than fear. Eleanor smiled, tears bright in her eyes. "Yes, our child." Adrian pressed his forehead to hers, gratitude and love written plainly across his face. He no longer feared happiness. He no longer waited for loss. He had learned that loving deeply did not summon tragedy. It gave meaning to survival. They read together often now, sometimes aloud, sometimes in comfortable silence. The library remained their sanctuary, the place where everything had begun. Adrian commissioned a portrait of Eleanor there, seated by the window with a book in her hands, light falling gently across her face. It hung beside the portraits of his ancestors, not as decoration, but as truth. She belonged there. Eleanor sometimes thought back to the night she had packed her trunks, to the doors locked in desperation, to the pain that had driven her to choose herself. She understood now that walking away had not been an act of rejection. It had been an act of survival. And survival had forced truth into the light. Adrian never locked another door. Years later, as their child played among the roses, Eleanor watched Adrian from across the garden. He stood with sunlight in his hair, laughter in his voice, life fully embraced. She thought of the man she had married, cold and unreachable, and marveled at the transformation. Love had not erased his past. It had given him the courage to live alongside it. Adrian caught her watching him and smiled. That open smile meant only for her. He crossed the garden and took her hand, grounding himself in her presence as naturally as breathing. "I am glad you stayed," he said quietly. "So am I," Eleanor replied, "but I am glad I was willing to leave." He nodded, understanding completely. They stood together in the garden they had rebuilt, in the life they had chosen, knowing that love was not the absence of fear, but the decision to face it together. And in that choice, they found something stronger than loss. They found home.